The girl was barefoot when they drove her out, mud caked between her toes, blood drying where the straps of her two small shoes had broken 2 days earlier. She hadn't cried, not once, not even when the town elder, Mr. Garvin, raised his voice so sharp it felt like it split the sky open. "She stole," he said, turning to the others, who stood in a horseshoe formation around her, dozens of settlers, all tight-lipped and stony-eyed. "We got one sack of flour left, and she took half. That's no mistake. That's survival for someone else gone." They didn't care she was just a child. They didn't care that her mother had died in the early fall and that nobody else had taken her in proper. They didn't care that she'd taken the flour to eat raw, spoonfuls of it mixed with meltwater she'd boiled over pine needles, or that she'd slept the last 3 nights in the woodshed because her uncle locked her out when he found her coughing. They called her Willa, though none of them said it kindly. Just Willa the mouse, Willa the sneak, Willa the burden. By noon that day, they'd tied up her things in a patchy wool blanket, an empty tin cup, a belt knife with no handle, and a single jar of pickled eggs, and marched her beyond the edge of the settlement. No family, no escort, no plan, just a line in the dirt made by a boot heel, and the warning, "Don't cross it back." The snow started that night. Willa wandered for 3 days before she stopped shaking long enough to build a fire. On the 4th day, she found a bluff, north-facing hard stone, crumbling in places where meltwater had eaten through cracks. Something about it reminded her of her mother's voice when she was alive. Not the tone, not the words, the stillness. She cleared away the brush with a stick, pulled rocks aside one by one until her fingernails tore, and tunneled into it the way she'd once seen prairie dogs do when she'd been small enough to sit on her mama's hip. At first, it was just a shallow scrape, barely deeper than a crawl space, but by the end of that week, it became a trench, and within that trench, she dug deeper, deeper into the slope, deeper into the frozen earth, deeper into silence. What she built couldn't be called a cabin, not by frontier standards. There was no upright frame, no stove, no logs or nailed-down rafters, but she had something no one else did. The ground, packed, dense, stubborn ground that didn't let heat escape easy. She took stones and built a crescent-shaped wall at the mouth of her hole, low to the ground and curved like a cradle. She stacked dry grass and pine needles between the outer wall and her sleeping space, packed in layers of earth, and used a bent branch with buffalo hide draped over it as a false roof. Smoke from her fire snaked through a little clay-lined vent she carved near the rear. The space never got warm, but it never got cold either, not like outside. She kept to herself. She learned which mosses tasted less bitter, which roots cooked soft if you soaked them long enough, which birds flew lower when snow was coming. She buried the rest of the pickled eggs, and when she dug one up every week, it was still good. She rationed like an old woman, and each night she laid down on a bed of pine needles. She curled tight in the dirt shelter she made herself, and whispered aloud, "I ain't dying out here." What the town didn't know was that the storm hadn't just passed through, it had settled, and by the 2nd month, their supplies were gone. The town of Godwin's Hollow was never meant to survive a full frontier winter. It had sprung up like a weed between 2 failed cattle routes. Nothing but 6 cabins, a smithy, and 1 church built half out of adobe. When the roads iced up and wagons stopped passing through, they were on their own. What little food remained got locked in the meeting hall. Every family claimed they'd taken none, but at night, lanterns flickered behind drawn curtains, and whispers about Willa's exile quieted into guilt. Not that they said her name, not that they admitted what they'd done. But mothers began looking longer at their children's thin faces. Fathers stomped through snow to the smokehouse and found nothing but hard frost and rats, and slowly something gnawed at them, not hunger alone, but shame. By the 3rd month, 3 cabins had lost their roofs in the wind. 1 family froze inside theirs, unable to even break the door open after it iced shut. The McLarens, who'd once claimed Willa took more than just food, were found half buried in snowdrift, the mother still clinging to a child who'd gone stiff days before. The wind grew crueler. It came from the north, cutting down through the hills, and it whistled sometimes in the dead of night, like a child's voice howling across the bluffs. Willa was alive, not thriving, but alive. She'd learned how to line her tunnel walls with dried grass and old bark, how to use dirt and stone to trap heat around a single ember, how to breathe into her hands till her fingers worked again. She didn't wait for spring. She didn't believe in it anymore. She just focused on surviving. Each day she crawled out early, climbed the slope above her shelter, and looked at the horizon. Nothing moved, nothing but snow and wind and the sky gone grey as wool. On the rare days it cleared, she watched smoke trails in the distance, knowing the town was suffering. Sometimes she wondered if they'd come for her, but no one ever did, until one day she saw footprints, boot tracks, Deep, heavy, not hers, 2 sets, one wide, one smaller. The direction was wrong, headed toward her shelter, not away. She froze, then scrambled back down the slope, tossed a hide over the mouth of her shelter, and crouched silent in the darkness. Holding the knife with no handle, she counted heartbeats, waited. They came at dusk. The first voice was hoarse, male. The second, a child's. "See that?" the man said. "That's smoke. It's real," the child said. "Not another frozen log?" The man didn't answer. The brush parted. A face appeared. A man in his late 30s, beard rimed with frost, one eye half swollen shut. Behind him, a girl, maybe 7, wrapped in rags. Willa didn't say a word. The man's gaze met hers. He didn't ask to come in. He just knelt and whispered, "Please." Willa let them crawl in one by one. She didn't speak for a while, just fed them a little boiled root and let them warm their hands near her coals. The girl cried when her fingers thawed. The man said nothing. Only after an hour did he look up and say, "We were the last in our cabin. Roof caved in 2 nights ago. We ran." Willa stared. He added, "I know who you are. I didn't vote. I told him it wasn't right." She turned away, said nothing. But something shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. And somewhere in the dark, she realized they were coming. Not just him, others. Cold, hungry, desperate, because the storm hadn't stopped, and she was the only one with ground above her head. The man's name was Caleb, and the girl was his niece, Ely, though Willa didn't ask. He offered the names quiet, without pride, as if they were already ghosts. He sat curled near the entrance, legs drawn in tight, his face turned toward the little vent, where the last of the light filtered through clay-packed cracks. The child wouldn't stop shivering. Willa gave her her own half-dried buffalo hide and a lump of warm stone she'd heated by the coals. It wasn't kindness, not really. It was instinct, something older than forgiveness. She didn't talk much. The words had dried up over the months. Her voice came out scratchy, like wind caught in a bottle. Still, she'd mutter a few things. "Don't touch that wall," or "only eat half," or "blow into your hands before you stir the fire." The shelter had its rules. The cold didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did the ground. Caleb, once warmed, didn't beg for more. That was something she noticed. He didn't rummage or ask what else she had. He watched. He listened. And on the 3rd morning, before the frost melted from the walls, he rose and said, "I'll hunt." Willa nodded once. That was enough. He returned with nothing the first day. A frostbit rabbit the second, and 2 half-frozen quails the 3rd. They didn't speak of how far he'd gone. He never said whether he'd seen others, only that the smoke from the town had dwindled and the snow was getting worse. On the 7th night, as the winds screamed outside and packed snow filled every divot in the bluff, Ellie whimpered in her sleep, murmuring for her mother. Willa looked at the girl, thin, hair matted, nose crusted with old blood from cracked skin. Willa remembered crying like that once, before her mother's voice vanished for good, before they locked her out with the wolves. She leaned over and tucked the hide tighter around the girl. Then she whispered, "Just once, you're not gonna die. Not while I'm still breathing," she meant. "Not while this hole still holds." Word traveled in whispers. And even when no mouths moved, Caleb returned from one of his hunts and said quietly, "They know?" Willa paused. She was wrapping moss around a handful of hot coals to preserve them for later. "They've seen the smoke. More than one cabin's out. They're following it. I saw tracks. Lots." She didn't respond right away, just kept wrapping the moss, hands steady. Then, "How many?" Caleb squinted, then shook his head. 4, maybe 5 folks, but more will come, sooner or later." She didn't need to say it out loud. The tunnel wasn't big. It had been enough for her, then for 3. But more? The air barely moved. Even with the vent and the back chimney channel, too many bodies meant heat, and heat meant moisture, sweat, breath, condensation, then ice, then death. But what choice did they have? Willa stared at the smoke hole, where a thin drift of warmth escaped. It looked like a lifeline now, like a flag. She couldn't hide it, not unless they let the fire die. And if they did that, they might as well bury themselves now. "No one dies out here," she muttered, mostly to herself. But Caleb nodded. By the end of the next day, the first stranger appeared. She was maybe 40, bones tight against skin, eyes sunken, no coat, just a blanket tied around her like a shawl, dragging behind her in the snow. She didn't knock, didn't shout, just fell near the entrance. Ely screamed. Caleb hauled her in, half-conscious and mumbling. "Might be frostbit," he said, pulling her closer to the coals. Willa didn't speak, just gave him the knife and pointed to the vent. He understood. Scrape the ice, make sure it wasn't clogging. They'd need clean air now. The old woman's chest wheezed like wet bellows. The shelter smelled like smoke and wool and wet skin. That night, Willa sat with her back against the packed wall, staring across the cramped space. 4 of them now, rations already tight, and it wasn't even March yet. She whispered to the dirt beside her, the way she used to pray when she was younger, but no words came, just silence and the crackle of dying embers. More came, a boy no older than 9, carrying a blanket and dragging a skillet. He didn't even speak when they let him in, just collapsed by the wall and wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Then 2 men, one with half his face burned black from falling through a collapsed chimney. Then a pregnant woman who gave birth 2 days later, wrapped in old furs and screaming into the floor as Elie held her hand. The baby lived, somehow, but its cries made the walls feel thinner, the shelter feel smaller, the food taste like ash. By mid-month, Willa's tunnel shelter held 9 people. They slept curled like dogs, shoulder to shoulder. The vent was widened, the chimney scraped clear twice a day. Willa and Caleb took shifts, keeping the fire low but steady, never too bright, never too weak. They burned pine bark, twigs, and occasionally bits of dried buffalo dung wrapped in grass. Someone carved a prayer into the stone near the wall. Another sang at night, a tune so broken Willa couldn't tell if it was a hymn or a lullaby. But no one died, not yet. The snow buried the outside world. The bluff disappeared entirely beneath a drift nearly 10 feet high. The smoke vent had to be dug free every morning. Caleb tied a rope from the shelter entrance to a dead tree 20 paces away just to orient himself when the world turned white. Inside, they ran out of flour, then of meat. They boiled roots, then bark, then shoes. Still, they lived. One morning, Caleb returned with news. The town was gone. Gone how? Willa asked, her voice a rasp. Cabins empty, doors open. No smoke, no noise, just wind and bones. Willa didn't reply, just stared at the flame licking low inside the stone ring. Then slowly, she shifted her coat tighter and whispered, "So it's just us now." Then the wind changed. It came from the south, not the north, and with it, thaw. Not warmth, not yet, but the promise of it. A different scent on the air. The snow grew crusty on top, brittle in the afternoons. The vent didn't need scraping as often. Inside the shelter, the walls began to weep with meltwater. They hung cloth to catch it, let it drip into tin cups. Willa caught the first one and drank slow. Outside, the sound of birds returned. Far off, single calls like scouts. Inside, the baby opened its eyes and smiled for the first time. Something was breaking, something was ending, but something else was about to begin. And Willa knew the world they left behind wouldn't recognize them anymore. Not after what they'd built, not after what they'd become. The thaw didn't come all at once. It never did, not in that part of the frontier. First came the illusion, the slight give in the snow beneath your boots, the dampness in your sleeves when the sun touched your shoulder for half an hour longer than usual. Then the betrayal, the refreeze at night, harder than before, sharper somehow, as if mocking you for hoping. Inside the tunnel shelter, the air changed. Willa noticed it before the others. It wasn't just the water dripping off stone, or the way the dirt walls began to shed their frost in clumps. It was the smell, deeper, earthier, like rot starting to breathe again. It scared her. The tunnel had never been meant to last this long. It was a refuge, a hole in the earth stitched together by instinct and the thinnest margin of survival. Now, with 12 people huddled inside, the ground itself was waking up. Moisture seeped from the seams between rocks. Mold curled along the hides near the entrance. The packed ceiling sagged an inch, then 2. Caleb was the first to say it out loud. "We need to dig another exit." Willa didn't answer. Her hands were in the coals, slowly warming the last bit of rabbit fat they'd saved for Elie's cough. But her eyes didn't flinch. She'd known it for days. The problem was there was nowhere else to go. The snowpack above was still 8 feet deep. The main entrance stayed dug only because Caleb cleared it every morning with the sharpened end of a pot lid. The rear vent had iced shut again. Steam rose too fast and formed thick rime inside the shaft. There was no wood to brace a new path, no tools worth anything but Caleb's belt knife and a pair of frozen hatchets rusting near the stone ring. They were boxed in, not by walls but by the very ground that had once saved them. Still, they dug. It began with a spoon. One of the women, Miriam, a gaunt, sharp-eyed settler from the far cabin line, took a tarnished silver spoon and began scraping at the eastern wall just beyond the food nook. They cleared sleeping hides to make space. Then others joined in, using whatever they had, sticks, stone, even a ladle handle snapped from the cookpot. The tunnel began to branch. Willa didn't like it, not because it wasn't smart, it was. But the moment they started digging in different directions, it no longer felt like hers, her tunnel, her silence, her space. Still, she let it happen. She rationed tighter. She cut meat with more care. She showed Elie how to wrap twine into a makeshift wick when the last candle went out. And when the baby woke in the middle of the night coughing, Willa held her small body close to the warmest stone in the fire pit and let her cry into her coat, They all survived that week, but only barely. Then the roof sagged. It didn't collapse, not fully, but one morning, Caleb ran a hand along the ceiling just beyond the stone wall and came away with a palm full of wet clay. The weight of the snow above had begun pressing downward. If the ground shifted just slightly, or if they dug the wrong direction, the whole thing could fold in on itself, and then they'd all be buried, alive. Willa gathered them near the fire ring that night. Everyone, the full dozen, even the baby, wrapped in layers of hide, propped on her mother's lap, pink-cheeked and quiet. We stopped digging toward the east wall, Willa said flatly. Miriam looked up sharply. Why? The clay there's wet, pressing. You push harder, it'll come down. We've already lost half a finger's depth of ceiling height. I measure it. And then what? We just wait to suffocate? We dig up instead, Willa said. Slow, toward the surface. Let the sun do the rest. Caleb backed her. She's right. Temperature's rising. Couple more weeks. And the top layer'll crack. If we break through too early, cold'll rush in fast. If we wait, we get light. Maybe fresh air. Miriam stared hard at them both, then grudgingly nodded, but tension hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't rise. Even Ely could feel it. The next morning, Miriam wasn't there. They found her an hour later, buried in the collapsed eastern shaft. She'd gone in alone, with a ladle and a scarf. Sometime in the early dawn, no one had seen her. Maybe she thought she could prove them wrong. Maybe she just didn't trust Willa to lead anymore. Either way, it didn't matter. The dirt found her first. Caleb clawed through the cave-in, his arms bloodied from raw stone and frostbite. They dug until they found the scarf, then the spoon, then Miriam's boots. They never found her face. That night, Willa sat alone near the stone ring. No one asked what came next. They all knew. The next 2 weeks were the worst, not because the food was gone, it was mostly, but because silence set in, a new kind, not the quiet of frost or snow, but the dead silence of people waiting to die. They still moved, they still scraped bark and boiled water and wiped frost from the vent, but no one looked anyone else in the eye. No one sang. The fire crackled like it pitied them. Willa barely slept. She spent nights near the back, pressing her ear to the ceiling, listening for the shift of ice. Every sound, every distant groan of frost or faint crack made her heart slam against her ribs. She had nightmares, waking ones, the walls closing in, the fire hissing out, Ellie turning blue in her arms. She stopped praying, even to the dirt. Then one morning, a shout broke the world open. "Ah!" someone screamed. It was the boy, the silent one. He'd crawled up the new shaft, slow, steady, and found something thin. A pocket, a change in the cold. He called again. "I smell trees!" They all rushed the shaft, not like fools, careful, deliberate, but fast. Willa crawled in last, afraid to hope. The climb was hard, slick with mud and melting frost. But halfway up she felt it, a breeze, real, warm, moving air. The surface was near. They broke through just before dawn. The light stung their eyes, pale yellow, thin as a whisper, but it was light. Real sunlight. For the first time in months, Willa looked at the sky. It looked back. They climbed out one by one. The snow was thinning, still deep, still dangerous, but patchy in places. Ice clung to tree trunks. Drifts curled into ravines. But in the distance, green poked through. Spring was clawing its way back. Caleb stood beside her, eyes wide. "We made it," he said. "We really—" Willa didn't answer. She was staring toward the town, or what was left of it. Godwin's Hollow was gone, not just broken, erased. The cabins had collapsed under snow. Roofs caved in, doors splintered. One chimney still stood, like a gravestone. No movement, no smoke, no survivors. Except them, 12 souls crawling out of the earth like seeds breaking through frost. Willa stepped forward. Her foot hit dry ground. Then she whispered, "We don't go back." Caleb nodded slowly. "No, we don't." And together they turned toward the hills, toward something new, something alive, because the girl they exiled had built more than a shelter. She'd built the last place standing. And now, it was time to begin again. They stood on the rise above Godwin's Hollow for nearly an hour, just watching. Willa, Caleb, Ely, the baby and her mother, the rest of the tunnel survivors, all of them silent, wind threading through their torn coats and tangled hair. Below, the town looked like a painting abandoned to the snow, frozen in mid-collapse. Not a soul moved among the sunken roofs or broken fences. Chimneys leaned at angles no structure should survive. One house had split in half entirely, revealing its guts, stove crushed in, chairs piled like bones, Some walls peeled outward like paper soaked in rain. It was a graveyard, a place left behind by life. But it wasn't just the storm that had done it. Everyone standing there knew that. The cold had pressed down like a hammer, yes, but the real damage had come from the choices people made before the first snow ever fell. They'd locked their doors, turned away their weakest, guarded barrels of flour and blankets like gold. They'd exiled a child over a handful of rations, and now the settlement was gone, not because the storm had taken it, but because no one had been left willing to hold it together. The ones who had were standing above it. Willa didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt cold, not in her body, but in her heart, as if everything warm inside her had hollowed out and left behind only breath, movement, instinct. There were children to feed, a new path to find. The earth was softening, yes, but it would take weeks, months, before anything grew, and there were still more storms coming. "We can't stay here," she finally said. It wasn't a question. Caleb gave a small nod. "There's no wood left anyway, no livestock. Smokehouse caved in." Willa glanced at the others. They were watching her, not him, even the oldest among them. The woman with sunken cheeks and frostbitten toes was waiting on Willa's voice, and she felt it then, sharp and strange, the weight of it. Not power, not leadership, something rawer, the burden of being the one who knew what to do. "I know where the spring is," she said. "East of here, 2 miles. If it's running, we can drink." "And the bluffs?" Caleb asked. "Another mile past that. Better soil, trees still standing." "Some game in the ravine below. It's high ground, sheltered from the wind." She looked back at the tunnel entrance. Just a hole in the earth now, steam rising faintly from it. If she squinted, she could still see the dent where she'd first started digging with her bare hands. That had been months ago, a lifetime, when she was still just the girl they exiled. She turned away. "Pack everything that isn't frozen to the ground," she said. "We move before night." It took hours to gather what little they had. A broken skillet, a length of copper wire, one thin blade, a few scraps of hide. Willa let them take the stones from the fire ring, wrapped warm in cloth to carry with them. They'd keep burning them until the sun was strong enough to warm them instead. Ellie carried the rabbit bone necklace Willa had made for her in the darkest month. Just a simple string of whitened knuckles and carved notches. For protection, Willa had said. The girl believed it. The boy, still silent, carried a bundle of saplings Willa had half-planted outside the shelter's rear entrance. Roots still frozen, but not dead. They'd try to plant them again at the new place. By late afternoon, the group set off, 12 of them. No horses, no carts, just what they could drag, sling, or carry. The wind was quiet, the sun pale but steady. For the first time in weeks, Willa saw a crow flying overhead, black wings beating against a sky not quite blue, not quite grey. She took that as a sign. The journey to the spring was rough. Meltwater had turned the low paths to slush, and the high ridges were still crusted with brittle ice. One of the men fell into a drift and had to be pulled out by 2 others. The baby wailed for hours. Ailey's feet bled. Willa gave her the last strip of clean cloth she had and told her to wrap them tight. At dusk, they reached the spring. It was running, not fast, not full, but clear, trickling over stone and brush like a secret remembered too late. The first to drink was the old woman. Her hands trembled. She cupped the water and wept. They didn't build a fire that night. Too tired. Instead, they lay in a cluster near the roots of a pine stand and watched the stars blink through the branches. Willa sat upright for hours. She wasn't watching the sky. She was listening for footsteps, because deep down she knew if anyone else had survived, they'd be coming, and they'd be coming hungry. They reached the bluffs the next day. A ridge curled up from the frozen forest floor like a beckoning arm, stony, dry, sheltered on 3 sides. Trees clustered at its base, thin but tall, like fingers pointing towards spring. The ground was packed, but softening. Birds flitted through branches. Squirrels chattered far off. It was perfect. Willa told them where to dig. Not down, not this time. Across. She'd learned the lesson. Holes were safe, yes, but only when they could breathe. The new shelters would be dug into the side of the bluff, not beneath it. Shallow, angled, with stone-ringed fire pits and vents built out of clay and bark. They'd line the walls with thatch and old pine needles, roof them with overlapping bark and snow-patched hides, anchor the corners with stone. Not permanent, not yet, but it was a beginning. They worked in shifts. The baby was the first to laugh. Our real laughter, bubbly, clumsy, alive. It made the others stop for a second. Willa stood over a fire pit, watching the smoke curl into the sky. She didn't smile, but she let the sound wash over her. That night, they lit 3 fires. They had warmth, they had water, they had sky. The first outsider came 3 days later. A man, alone, beard to his chest, face black with soot, carrying a sack slung over one shoulder and dragging a rifle that looked rusted to uselessness. Willa spotted him first. He was downwind, trying to circle the bluff. She waited until he stepped into the clearing. Then she stood, arms crossed, knife on her belt. He froze when he saw her. Then he spoke. "I came from Silver Tree. Lost 3 cabins. Wind took the roof off mine. I've been walking for 2 weeks. Willa didn't answer. He held up both hands. I heard there was a place where folk survived. Said a girl built it. Young, knew how to trap heat, knew how to listen to the ground." His eyes were sunken. His lips cracked. "I'm not here to take," he said. "Just asking for a place to sit, a place to start again." Willa walked forward, slowly. She looked him over. Then, with a voice low as stone, she said, "You dig your own wall. You build your own vent. You eat last." The man nodded fast. Of course. She turned and pointed. "That ridge there. There's dry clay under it. Get to work before nightfall." He did. More came. Not many. A trickle. A family of 3. A widow with a splintered leg. 2 boys who hadn't spoken since they saw their father buried in snow. Willa greeted each one the same. With rules. With terms. You dig your wall. You build your vent. You eat last until you earn your share. No one argued, because by now, word had spread, across broken trails, through desperate mouths, that a girl who'd been cast out into the storm had built something the blizzard couldn't touch. A tunnel, a fire ring, a way to survive. Some called her the Mole Child, others whispered Earth Daughter, but those who met her just called her Willa, and they built what she told them to build, because hers was the only place still standing. The settlement had no name, not at first. It was just a cluster of fire pits and half-dug shelters, tucked into the bluff's shoulder like a scar in the land. No one put up a sign. No one declared a township. The survivors who arrived didn't care for that kind of thing anymore. They'd come from places with names: Silver Tree, Red Hollow, Dutch's Cut, and watched those names get buried under snow and rot. Here, no one needed names. What they needed was ground that held its shape when the frost came back. They needed a way to trap smoke so the cold didn't track it. They needed heat that didn't cost too much wood. And most of all, they needed someone who knew how to survive when everything else failed. They followed Willa. They didn't say it aloud, not like some church vow or pledge, but they did, quietly, completely, without ceremony. It happened in gestures, in the way they waited for her to nod before starting a new tunnel, or how they checked her face when debating whether a ridge could hold a roof. Even the older men, the ones who'd once sneered at the idea of a child leading anyone, now watched her with the wary reverence of soldiers around a campfire. She didn't want it, not really, but she didn't refuse it either. There were too many lives now tethered to her fire pit, too many children who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. By mid-spring, there were 22 shelters dug into the bluffs. Not all were finished. Some were no more than windbreaks and smoke holes, rough scoops in the rock with a hide strung across the top. But others had taken real shape: packed clay walls, sunken sleeping benches, even drainage trenches and firestone basins to hold heat longer after sundown. Willa had developed a system for the fire: dig a shallow pit, line it with the smoothest rocks you could find, then heat them for 3 hours before banking the flames and covering the stones with split pine and earth. The warmth would bleed slow, soft, through the floor. It wouldn't scorch. It wouldn't smoke. It just held. People started calling it Willa's trick. It wasn't a trick. It was necessity. But they clung to it like gospel, and it worked. By the end of May, someone found wild onions, not far from the creek bed, in a sunlit patch near the rocks. They sprouted thin and green. Willa helped dig them up with a stick, careful not to tear the roots. They ate the first ones that night, roasted over bark coals. Someone cried. By June, rabbits had returned in numbers. Birds nested in the trees above their shelters. Caleb made a snare line running from the north ridge to the tree grove and taught 2 boys how to check it at dawn. The first deer came through a week later. It was thin, ribs showing, but alive. Caleb brought it down with a stone-tipped spear. They skinned it together, quietly, gratefully. The hide was cured in smoke, the meat dried on racks strung with sinew and willow. For the first time, they had extra. The problem came with the thaw, not from lack, but from return. Survivors, from other settlements, from half-dead roads, people who'd hunkered in caves or beneath fallen carts, who'd lived on shoe leather and snowmelt. Word had spread, even without roads. There was a place, no town, no sheriff, no steeple, where the earth had been made to shelter people, where a child had built what grown men could not. They arrived alone, or in pairs, starving, hollow, clutching rags. One of them, a man missing 2 fingers and half a foot, collapsed before he spoke a word. His last breath was taken before a fire ring built with Willa's stone pattern. Another was a woman Willa recognized from Godwin's Hollow. Her name had been Mrs. Kennelly. She was the one who'd led the prayer against Willa the night they exiled her. The one who'd said, "We can't feed what won't feed us back." Willa stood still when she saw her. The woman's eyes were sunken, her dress shredded, boots long gone. She leaned on a branch like it was the last fence post of the world. She didn't speak. Willa didn't either. She simply pointed to a slope near the north bluff. "You build there," Willa said. "You'll get food after you dig your trench." Mrs. Kennelly stared, then nodded. She never brought up what she'd done. Willa never asked. But from that day on, she worked harder than most. She hauled stones with raw hands. She wove bark mats for the sick. And every night she slept nearest the coldest wind. No one questioned it. By midsummer, the bluff settlement had nearly 50 people. Still no name. Still no flags, just fire pits and low smoke curling through the trees, children barefoot in the dust, women baking roots in clay-wrapped embers, men carving tools from bones and sharpened stone. The sound of digging never stopped. Every morning, every night, another shelter started, another fire lit. Caleb stood watch at the ridge edge. He carved a walking stick and scratched marks into it each time someone new arrived. By August, it had over 60 notches. But it wasn't growth that made Willa nervous. It was the question: what happens when the earth stops giving? What happens when they ask for more than she can teach? The baby took her first steps in early fall. The whole camp gathered, watched her toddle between two stones, wobbling like a sapling in wind. Her mother wept. Willa didn't smile, but she crouched and opened her arms. The baby stumbled into them. Everyone cheered. Caleb later said, "This place is alive because of you." Willa shook her head. "No, it's alive because it listened. That's all I ever did. I listened to the ground." "You did more than that." "Maybe," she said, "but I won't be the last." And she wasn't. By that winter, others had started teaching. Ely, now older, sharper, taught the new children how to build clay vents. The silent boy built a tool rack from cured branches. Caleb took 3 boys hunting, left Willa behind for the first time in months. She didn't mind. She sat near her own fire, alone, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe, not from the cold, not from hunger, but from being forgotten, because they remembered now, and they would go on remembering. The years passed. The tunnel shelter collapsed the next spring, just as she'd expected. The earth had shifted. The snowmelt carved away the wall, but no one was inside. They'd all moved to higher ground. They dug it out anyway. As a lesson, they found the old fire ring, the moss-wrapped coals, the rabbit-bone necklace Willa had made for Ailey, buried in the clay like an offering. They built a stone ring around it, a circle, just waist-high. No name carved in it, just the shape of hands in clay, still warm from memory. They came from far away in later years, from places no one had ever heard of, salt towns and canyon holds, river huts and sunken groves, survivors, wanderers, children of storms. They followed whispers of a place where a girl had once survived being thrown out into the wild with nothing, a place that didn't fall. A place that wasn't built on pride or fences, but fire, dirt, and rules that mattered. One day, a man stood at the ring and asked, "Who was she?" An elder pointed. She was sitting beneath a tree, her hair streaked with gray now, knife still on her hip. The man blinked. "That's her?" "Yes," the elder said. "That's Willa." He called out, "You the one who built it? The shelter?" She didn't look up. She just said, "No, the ground built it." I listened. And then she stood, walked back toward the bluff, toward the smoke, toward the place still standing.